Welcome back to lesson number 3 under peer teaching and media practicals. In this lesson, we are going to discuss the teaching skills that are practiced during micro-teaching. Welcome to the lesson. And we start by looking at what is your take-home after this lesson. So I would expect you to state what a teaching skill is as number 1. Number 2, you should be able to identify specific teaching skills practiced during micro-teaching. Number 3, you should be able to explain the purpose of each skill in making teaching effective. And number 4, you should be able to demonstrate how each skill is used during micro-teaching. And the last one, state the advantages of micro-teaching as a teacher training technique. Only 5 outcomes for this lesson. Now we start looking at teaching skill first. So teaching is a complex behavior aimed at the realization of a defined objective. In a classroom, a teacher does so many things, and these things are planned, they are organized from the introduction to the presentation to examples up to the summary or conclusion of a lesson. So there are many skills that are involved. Therefore, when we come to defining a teaching skill, we can say it is a set of interrelated instructional components that a teacher uses to help a learner to achieve a specified outcome. The teaching skills can be developed in a trainee teacher through micro-teaching. Remember, we defined micro-teaching in lesson number 2. Now, acquisition of micro-teaching skills makes a teacher effective and efficient during classroom delivery. This is why the essence of micro-teaching, remember, is to prepare you to be able to handle a full class of 50, 60 students, and you take them through a normal lesson that may be 40 minutes or 80 minutes. So let's look at these skills that are practiced during micro-teaching. There are many skills, but we are going to look at the ones that are most common. And we start with the first one, set induction. Number 2 is a presentation of content, followed by illustrating with examples. Number 4 is a stimulus variation. Questioning is the next skill. Reinforcement and closure. We are going to consider these 6. There are many more skills, but first of all, we concentrate on these 7, like you see them on the screen. And we start with the first one, set induction. Now, set induction refers to those activities and the steps that are taken by a teacher to begin a lesson. In simpler words, it is the introduction to the lesson. Now, you have been in school perhaps from primary school and secondary school, university now, and every time a teacher comes to the classroom, they introduce the lesson. So this lesson, introduction to the lesson, is what we refer to as set induction, and it is concerned with getting the students' attention, their focus and interest in the lesson that is just about to start. It is aimed at getting the students ready, induced, or tuned to the right frame of mind or mindset to start learning. Perhaps the previous lesson was a Kiswahili lesson or a geography lesson, and this time you are teaching a mathematics lesson or a physics lesson and so on. So you need to change, to shift from the previous to the present lesson. There may be things that may have been left on the chalkboard. There may be charts that are on the chalkboard, and you do not want them to become a distraction to your lesson. So as part of the preparation, as part of the introduction, you get rid of anything that might distract your students in terms of what was on the board, textbooks they may have been using, exercises they may have been attempting, or other activities that may have been going on in the previous lesson. So what is the purpose of this set induction? The first one is to arrest and gain the learner's attention. For you to be able to teach effectively, the learners must pay attention to what you as the teacher is saying, what you as the teacher is doing, what you as the teacher is giving as instructions to be followed, and therefore you need their full attention. Secondly, to place the learners in a state of readiness to start learning. They must be ready to learn for you to succeed in your lesson. Number 3, to set the appropriate framework of mind for the new lesson. You must have that shift from the previous to the present lesson, and oftentimes those lessons are very, very different indeed. It may have been an English lesson, language, and what you are now going to do is a science lesson. So there needs to be a shift. Then you may perhaps be continuing with a previous lesson, and therefore you need to establish a link between what they know, what they are going to learn, and perhaps what they had learned before this lesson. And now the next one is to open up new concepts or principles and their meaning before you start the lesson. So set induction, remember, before we move on to the next one, basically it means introducing your lesson using various means. All of them are focused at the attention of the student before you start the lesson. During the lesson now, the skill that a teacher is encouraged to practice is stimulus variation. Stimulus variation is concerned with stimulating each of the 5 senses in the students for purposes of learning. Now, when we talk about the 5 common senses, we have the sense of sight, the sense of hearing, the sense of smell, the sense of taste, the sense of touch, and we learn from each one of these senses each day of our life. And the same senses are now used for learning in the classroom, and they need to be stimulated either at the same time or different times. Now, how can you achieve this stimulus variation? 1, the teacher should not be stationary in one position. You should be able to move to the back row, to the middle section of the class. You need to move between the rows and find out or monitor what the students are doing. So you should not be static. You should not be a statue in front of the class. The second one is using the audio and visual aids or media. You can use a radio, you can use a video to break the monotony of the students listening to the same voice for 40 minutes or 80 minutes. Using body and facial gestures. There are some people who are very good in using their hands as they explain something. Body language, we are told, speaks sometimes louder than words. So when you are in the lower classes, you are talking about the sun rising in the east, then you point in the east direction. It sets in the west, you point in the west direction. When you are explaining in a language class something about attire, then you can have the examples of attire, a hat, a tie, a shoe, and so on. So you can use audio and visual aids to contribute to this stimulus variation. You can also use the body and facial gestures. Then a change in voice and tone. Sometimes when the teacher wants to stress a point, they use a higher tone, not a monotone. They use a higher tone than the normal. They speak perhaps louder to stress a point. Then pausing to allow a point to sink or to recapture attention. Sometimes you may notice the students are not paying attention, and therefore when you pause, you keep quiet for a while, and you just look at them. Then they wonder what has happened to the teacher. They look forward, and they are able to go back to the point of attention before you move on to the next point. Change in interaction pattern. So sometimes you do not have in your lesson to confine yourself to the classroom all the time. You can go for a nature walk within the school compound depending on the lesson you are teaching. Not a leisure walk this time, but a nature walk with a purpose. You can involve them in a discussion. You break up your students into small groups. You give a topic, a familiar topic for them to discuss. They appoint their leadership and protocols where this is the chairperson, this is the recorder, this is the, somebody who are with another responsibility. This is the sergeant at arms when they become an ruler in that group. That's the person to take over, and so on. So this discussion helps to move away from listening to the teacher, depending on the teacher all the time. They will now also learn to be interdependent. Then you can also organize a field trip where they can get out of the school compound to an area of interest. For example, if you have a topic in biology on genetics, plant breeding, perhaps you could take your students to an agricultural research station where plant breeding is carried out. They can interact with the researchers there, they can observe the plants, and so on. If you are a physics teacher, after you have taught something about sources of electricity, how electricity is generated, you could take them to a place like Kindaruma or Karia Geothermal Station, where the students can experience what goes on during power generation in those different areas. And then we go to another skill, which is very, very common. There is no class that goes on, or any lesson that goes on without the teacher asking some questions, students are responding to those questions, or the students themselves asking questions to the teacher after a lesson. So this leads us to the skill of questioning. We have different categories of questions. We have the introductory or the preliminary questions. Those are the ones that are asked during the set induction stage at the beginning of the lesson. The teacher may ask questions like, have you seen or met this phrase before? Have you seen this picture before? Have you heard about this concept before? There are those questions that are asked before the beginning of the lesson. Then there are those questions that are asked during the presentation stage. We call them, or we refer to them as developing questions. Then recapitulatory questions, from the word recapitulate. You ask these questions for reflection and for a deeper understanding of the concepts. You allow time, you allow the students time to think about the statements you have made, to think about the questions you have asked, so that they can recall what they have learned. Then we have the evaluative questions that the teacher asks towards the end of the lesson. And these are evaluative questions to find out to what extent have they been able to achieve the objectives or the points that you have taught. Then you have the application questions. And these questions are aimed at finding out whether the students can apply the theories that they have learned in class to practical problems. All those theories, all those concepts that you have learned, can the students be able to apply them outside the class? Let's take an example. In a physics class, the physics teacher has taught the topic on friction. The teacher has talked about the causes of friction, the effects of friction, and ways to reduce friction. Now, the application questions, or what they are supposed to, what they are expected to do when they leave the class. I would expect, as a physics teacher, that as they move out of the class, they will swing the door and find out whether there is any noise coming from the hinges. And if there is any noise coming from the hinges, that is a signal that there is friction. I would expect them to be proactive. They'll go and look for a lubricant, apply it at the hinges to reduce friction. In an agriculture class, having taught this topic friction, we have those implements that they use in agriculture. For example, a wheelbarrow. Now, the wheel and axle of the wheelbarrow, where the wheel moves on the axle, if there is any noise coming from the wheelbarrow as you move it along or as you carry something in the wheelbarrow, I would expect these students to apply the knowledge of friction and how it can be reduced by again applying either used oil or some other lubricant to the axle, to the wheel, so that that friction is reduced, and therefore there will be no wear and tear in the wheelbarrow for a long time. They can use it for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, and so on, but they have to keep applying that lubricant every now and then. That is the essence of this last category of questions, application questions. Then we can also classify questions in several other ways. The first one is by the level. We have the low order questions, those that ask the students to remember, the recall kind of questions. Those questions that try to find out whether the student has understood, comprehension questions. Usually they are very, very simple. That's why they are referred to as low order. It's the student's memory. Then we have the mid order questions. For example, those questions where the students are expected to apply something, to analyze something. Those are mid order questions. For example, you may have a graph, and on the graph you have the y and the x axis. If you plot a graph, then you would ask questions based on that graph. That would be the middle order questions, where they analyze the graph and then they derive answers from that graph. Then we have the higher order questions that require a lot of thinking or higher cognitive abilities, synthesis and evaluation questions. Synthesis means putting things together. Evaluation, you are giving judgment. Then we can also classify questions by type. We have the open-ended or the divergent questions. Maybe we could take an example of suggest ways in which pollution in our town can be reduced. That is now open-ended. The students can give 10 points, 10 suggestions, 15 suggestions. It is left open. We can also have closed or convergent questions. For example, you would have a question like, state 5 advantages of micro-teaching. You are limited, closed, only 5, not more than 5. Or defined an oxbow lake in geography. Research questions. These are research questions. They take much longer. And the kind of research questions, if we take an example, is what kind of pollutants are found in your hometown, and how can you reduce their effect on the population? It means the student must go out, gather a lot of information, make observations, interview key stakeholders, and then they do a write-up. They analyze the data, they interpret the data, they make conclusions, they write a report. So our research questions takes a bit of time to address. Then a continuation of this classification of questions, we have evaluative questions. Remember, judgmental, where you are judging the value of something. Discussion questions. You may have a question where the students are supposed to discuss. For example, in what ways can a population reduce the spread of a virus? among themselves. That's an open question for discussion, and everybody will give their opinion. Then we have other types of questions which we can classify by level of difficulty. We have simple questions. These simple questions start with words like what. What is the name of this? When? When did this event happen? Where? Where does this take place? Who? Who is responsible for this or the other? Those words denote simple questions. Then we have difficult questions, like the questions that start with how. How does this process take place? Why does the sun rise in the east? Those are difficult questions. You have to have a bit of a reasoning and considerations before you can answer them. Then the next skill that is practiced during micro-teaching is the skill of reinforcement. This is a very interesting skill. It is usually applied after a student has responded to an oral or a written question. It serves to encourage and motivate the student who has answered. It is a form of a non-material reward. It is an expression of a teacher's appreciation of the student's effort. Excuse me. It especially boosts the morale of the shy, the introverts, and the weak students. And for this reinforcement, what kind of words or phrases does the teacher use? So when my student has answered a question and they have answered it correctly, I may make comments like excellent, good, spot on, well done, or well tried. This encourages the student who has answered, and especially if they happen to be the shy students or the introverts, they feel they have been appreciated, is a kind of a reward. So this reinforcement is part and parcel of questioning. Anytime a student has responded to a teacher's question, reinforcement is expected. It also helps them to know whether the answer they provided is correct or incorrect, or to what extent their answer met the requirements of what was expected. Then we come to the last skill in any micro-teaching session is the skill of closure. You can see this word closure comes from the word close, to close something. So closure is concerned with bringing a lesson to an end. I have taught my lesson. I am coming to the very last step of my presentation, maybe a summary or conclusion. So those activities that the teacher does towards the end of the lesson is what we refer to as closure. Now in closure, what does the teacher do? The teacher summarizes the major points of the lesson. The teacher asks questions on the lesson that has just been taught. Many times the teacher will highlight the salient features learned in that lesson. Recapitulation or revision or review of the lesson that has just been taught. You also may give a relevant task or exercise for practice in the class, especially in mathematics and languages. After a concept or a formula has been introduced, the students practice how to apply that formula in a calculation, in a drawing, and so on. So those exercises form part of the closure. Then sometimes the teacher gives a takeaway assignment, out of class assignment. What we are, in olden days the teachers would refer to as homework. We now call it out of class assignment. This is also given during closure. So closure in many words or in a few words is bringing a lesson to an end. And there are various ways of doing that, like we have seen on the screen. Now during closure, what should the teacher do? One, ensure you obtain feedback from the students. You need to know whether the students have followed the lesson. Have they captured the key points that you have been teaching or emphasizing on? Are they able to do the activities correctly? So you need that feedback by asking questions, by giving an exercise, a task, a problem for them to solve. Then in closure, you involve the students in closure. Be accommodative. Let not the teacher just bring the lesson to an end. You have been teaching students, get feedback from them, involve them as you come to the end of the lesson. Maybe there are some things that they are finding difficulties in. You need to get that from them, and then you address those difficulties. Then during closure, link the theories learned to practical applications. Remember, after the class, these students have a life out of the school. Are those theories applicable outside the classroom setting? And finally, we would say, can you always spare time, maybe 5 to 10 minutes for closure? So you don't rush your lesson to an end. It's always important to consider the salient points in closure. Now, advantages of micro-teaching. The trainee teacher concentrates on practicing one teaching skill at a time. This is an advantage. Remember, we have seen there are so many skills that are practiced in micro-teaching, but this technique offers the opportunity to the student to practice one skill at a time. Micro-teaching helps in reducing the complexities of the normal classroom teaching so that the trainee teacher, the student teacher is not overwhelmed by so many techniques. They concentrate on one at a time. Then the complex task of teaching is broken down into simpler classroom behaviors one by one. Micro-teaching works as a laboratory exercise, focusing on the acquisition of teaching skills, where a trainee teacher can experiment on several alternatives without much risk. Remember, in micro-teaching, the teacher is one of the students who is practicing, and he teaches fellow students. So if there are mistakes made, this can be corrected without much harm. It would not be the same if this teacher goes to teach a normal class for 40 minutes, teaching complex skills. If the teacher makes mistakes, the damage will be greater because you are teaching fresh students who don't know. But in micro-teaching, you are teaching your fellow students. In addition, we can also say micro-teaching saves time and energy of the trainee teacher and that of the students. You save a lot of time because micro-teaching lesson takes 10 to 15 minutes only. Then immediate and systematic feedback is provided. This feedback is provided just for that lesson, for that skill that has been practiced. And then from there, the student is able to find out the weaknesses and areas of improvement. Then micro-teaching as a technique for training teachers, it caters for individual differences among the trainees. Those students who take a little longer, they can still take their own time until they master a skill. They can repeat a lesson as many times as may be required. So those individual differences of the slow, the average, and the fast are catered for. We said in micro-teaching, there is provision for repetition until mastery is attained. Then the risks, they are reduced because in micro-teaching, the student teacher or the trainee teacher is teaching fellow students. And finally, we would say the trainee students assist one another during micro-teaching as they take turns. Remember, they are the ones who give feedback to the teacher in quotes. And finally, as we bring our lesson to an end, remember we used the term closure. What have we discussed in our lesson? What is your take home? Identify the teaching skills that are practiced during micro-teaching. You may recall the set induction, stimulus variation, questioning, reinforcement, and so on. Teaching skills are practiced during micro-teaching. How is each skill carried out? And what are the advantages of this teacher training technique referred to as micro-teaching? And before we take a break, there is an out-of-class assignment for you. Briefly explain how the following teaching skills are used during micro-teaching. 1. Presentation of the content. 2. Illustrating with examples. And question number 2 is highlight the economic advantages of micro-teaching over teaching practice as techniques of training teachers. And that brings us to the end of our third lesson on peer teaching, where we focused on the skills that are practiced during micro-teaching. Thank you.
These televised lectures supplement our robust online learning going on our MKU online platform. You can view more on our televised lectures via our online platform. We are in a digital era, and Mount Kenya University knows this. The following are the steps to follow so as to complete your online application. Download the application form from the website www.mku.ac.ke. Attach copies of your academic certificates and ID. Pay the application fees via M-Pesa pay bill number 270988. Your ID is the account number. 2,000 shillings is the charge for a postgraduate. You can also deposit in the bank accounts provided on the website. Then email all the above to apply@mku.ac.ke.